The verdict came in numbers: 4,312,000 dead. Not soldiers, not fighters, just people who lived on a rock called Vesta Prime and grew food and raised children and thought the war was something that happened far away. The Dominion Accord did not fire a warning shot. They did not send a message first. High Warlord Grath gave the order at 300 Galactic Standard Time, and by 3:40 the colony was ash. He recorded the whole thing and broadcast it across every open channel in the known galaxy. He sat in his command chair while the planet burned behind him on the view screen, and he said, in the common tongue that every species shared, "Let this be the answer to every human petition that will ever be filed." Then he ended the feed. Ambassador Doran Hess was on Harrow Station when it happened. He had spent 19 years as Earth's voice to the Accord. He was 61 years old. He had a daughter who painted watercolors and a son who taught mathematics at a university in Nairobi. He had gray at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes, and he had shaken hands with 11 different species and negotiated peace across 7 disputed sectors. Grath's soldiers came for him 4 minutes after the broadcast ended. They dragged him into the main hall of Harrow Station, where every species had representatives, where the walls were made of transparent alloy and you could see the stars, and they put him on his knees. Grath did not appear in person. He appeared on a screen. He looked at Hess the way someone looks at an insect before stepping on it. "Tell your people," Grath said, "that this is what happens when they refuse to understand their place." One of the soldiers fired. The entire galaxy was watching. On Earth, it was 4:12 in Geneva when the feed reached the Parliament building. The chamber was already full. Nobody had slept. Councillor Petra Vance sat at the head of the long table and watched the recording on the screen at the far end of the room. She watched it once. She did not look away. When it ended, she sat still for a moment, and the room was so quiet that people could hear each other breathing. Then she pulled a single document from the folder in front of her. The Total War Declaration. It had been drafted 17 years ago and updated 3 times since. It had never been signed. Every counselor who had ever seen it had treated it like a last resort so extreme that bringing it out was itself a kind of failure. Vance uncapped a pen. Old style, ink. She signed her name at the bottom of the page. She did not make a speech. She did not explain her reasoning. She capped the pen, set it down, stood up, and walked out of the chamber. The document was transmitted to United Earth Command within the minute. Admiral Renata Solis received it in the asteroid belt, where she had been waiting for 11 days. Not because she had been told to wait, because she had known this was coming before anyone in Parliament wanted to admit it. She had positioned her fleet quietly, without orders, without explanation, because she understood something the rest of the galaxy had not yet learned about her species. Humans did not react well to being pushed past a certain point. And that point, as of 3:40 Galactic Standard Time, had been crossed. She read the declaration once. Then she opened a channel to every human vessel in the fleet, and to every civilian broadcast relay that Earth Command controlled, and to every open diplomatic frequency in the galaxy. Every species with a receiver heard what she said next. "This is Admiral Renata Solis of the United Earth Command. As of this moment, the human species is in a state of total war against the Dominion Accord. We are not filing a protest. We are not requesting arbitration. We are not seeking terms. When this is over, we will tell you it is over. Until then, stay out of our way." She cut the channel. On the Accord capital world of Vora, Grath received the broadcast and laughed. His council laughed with him. Humans had made threats before. Humans had always backed down before. They were too few, too young as a species, too fragile. They had no real fleet. They had no real army. They had petitions and diplomats and a fondness for talking. Subwarlord Dreth did not laugh. He sat quietly at the far end of the council table and looked at the star maps and said nothing. He had studied humans for years, longer than anyone else in the Accord. He had read their history, the parts of it that made the Accord's historians deeply uncomfortable. He had read about a species that had gone to war against itself for 10,000 years and never once stopped. A species that turned grief into fuel and loss into purpose. A species that, when it decided something was worth dying for, was almost physically incapable of stopping. He looked at the star maps and thought about the number 4 million. Then he thought about what humans had done throughout their own history, every time someone killed that many of them. He did not laugh. Outside in the galaxy, in 100 different council chambers and war rooms and diplomatic offices, different species were having different reactions. Some laughed. Some sent congratulatory messages to the Accord. Some said nothing and quietly began reviewing their own defense plans. Some called emergency sessions. And in a small office on a neutral station near the edge of Accord space, Liaison Neva Oren of the Tharan people wrote a single short message to her government and marked it urgent. The message said, "Begin emergency shelter construction. Do not wait for approval. Do not ask questions. Just begin." She had met humans before. She had shared meals with them and traded stories with them and argued with them about philosophy until the early hours of the morning. She knew what they were like when they were calm and curious and patient. She had no interest in seeing what they were like now. The first strange thing the Accord noticed was the silence. For 19 days after the declaration, human space went completely quiet. No diplomatic signals, no trade convoys, no civilian traffic on any monitored lane. It was as if 4 billion people had simply stopped existing. The Accord's intelligence division flagged it as unusual and then decided it meant humans were frightened, that they had made their declaration and then retreated behind their borders to wait for the inevitable response. Grath sent 3 cruisers toward the outer human border to test this theory. They reached the border. They crossed it. They stopped transmitting 8 minutes later. No explosion was detected. No weapon signature. No debris field appeared on any scanner. The cruisers simply stopped existing in the same way the humans had stopped being loud. The Accord's intelligence division stopped using the word frightened. What had actually been happening in human space for those 19 days was something the Accord had no framework to understand, because it required understanding something specific about how humans worked. They did not wait for their government to tell them what to do when they were angry enough. They just did it. The shipyards in the asteroid belt had been running at civilian capacity for 11 years. That capacity was, in the Accord's estimation, modest. What the Accord did not know, because humans had been careful for a long time about what they showed and what they hid, was that beneath the asteroid belt's visible construction platforms, there were 17 additional yards that had never appeared on any trade registry. They had been built over 40 years, slowly, quietly, funded through budget lines that were labeled agricultural infrastructure and deep space geological survey equipment. On the day the declaration was signed, every one of those yards went a full production simultaneously. Captain Yusuf Amara stood in the operations center of Yard 7 and watched the output numbers on the screen in front of him. He had a calm face. He always had a calm face. People who worked with him said it was either reassuring or unsettling depending on the situation, and right now most of them found it deeply unsettling because the numbers on the screen were things that should not have been possible. "At current rate," said the technician beside him, "we will have 47 additional destroyers ready for deployment in 9 days. "Make it 6, Amara said. The technician stared at him. "Pull the workers from the secondary projects. Everyone builds destroyers until I say otherwise." He turned from the screen. "And tell the fabrication teams on yards 3 and 11 to stop sleeping on shift. I don't care if that sounds unreasonable. It is unreasonable. That's fine." He walked out. The technician looked at the other technician next to her. Neither of them said anything. They just started making calls. This was the second strange thing the Accord began to notice around day 23, when the silence ended and was replaced by something much worse. Human ships appearing in places they should not have been, not in large groups, in small, fast, precise groups that hit supply lines and vanished before any response could reach them. Accord logistics depots on 6 different systems were destroyed in a single night. Not raided, not damaged, destroyed. 6 systems, 1 night. Simultaneous strikes calculated to the minute, so that no alert from one location could warn any other. Sub-Warlord Dreth brought the attack pattern to Grath's War Council the following morning. He laid the maps out on the table and pointed to the 6 locations, and explained what the timing of the attacks implied about human coordination and intelligence gathering. They knew where all 6 depots were, he said. They knew the patrol schedules at all 6 locations. They executed this without a single miscommunication across 6 separate star systems at the same time. This is not a species acting out of grief and anger. This is a species that was already prepared for this war before it started. Grath looked at the maps. They got lucky. High Warlord. They got lucky, Grath said again, and his voice made it clear the conversation was over. Dreth gathered his maps and said nothing more. Later that day, he sent a private message to 3 other senior Accord officers who he knew were also not laughing. The message was short. It said only, "Begin reviewing your personal contingency options." On a neutral station near the edge of the contested zone, Liaison Neva Oren was hosting a dinner for several ambassadors from species that had no formal alliance with either humans or the Accord. It was a quiet dinner. Everyone was being very careful about what they said out loud. One of the ambassadors, a tall, pale creature from a species called the Vethali, who communicated primarily through color shifts in their skin, asked Neva directly what she thought was going to happen. Neva thought about it for a moment. She poured herself a drink first. "I think," she said carefully, "that the Accord made a decision based on who humans were 20 years ago. And I think humans are not the same as they were 20 years ago. And I think the Accord has not noticed this." The Vethali ambassador shifted a pale orange across its neck, which meant something close to concerned. "And what are humans now?" Neva looked at her drink. "I had a human colleague once, good person, very patient, very calm. I watched someone steal from her twice and she said nothing both times. Then the third time she reported the person had them removed from the station and blocked every professional avenue they had, permanently. I asked her why she had waited. She said she had not been waiting, she had been collecting information." She set her drink down. The Accord just committed the 3rd offense. The Vethali shifted deep red. That meant afraid. Neva did not correct them. Back in the asteroid belt, Amara was looking at a new set of coordinates and a new set of targets. He had not slept in 31 hours. He did not look tired. He looked like a person with a very long list and a very reliable pen, working steadily from the top down. "Next targets," he said. "Accord Communication Relay Network, Sectors 9 through 14, the officer across from him said. "Destroying these cuts Accord command from its Eastern Fleet for approximately 40 hours. 40 hours is enough," Amara said. "Schedule it. There is a record stored in the Tharan Historical Archive on their home world of a creature called the Tarvan, a small animal native to one of the outer colony worlds. The Tarvan is unremarkable in almost every way. It is slow, quiet, and avoids confrontation. Predators in its ecosystem ignore it entirely. They have learned over thousands of years that the Tarvan is not worth the effort. It does not fight back. What the predators never discovered, because none of them survived the discovery, is that the Tarvan has no concept of retreat. It does not understand the idea of walking away from something that has threatened it. It will pursue a threat for days. It will pursue it injured. It will pursue it starving. It will pursue it until one of them stops existing, and the Tarvan is still alive after predators 10 times its size have died of exhaustion simply from being followed." The xenobiologist who wrote the entry added a note at the bottom. It said, "This creature reminds me uncomfortably of something. I am not sure what. I wrote this entry 6 months before humanity declared total war. I understand now." Sergeant Lior Barak did not know about the Tarvin. He was not a person who read xenobiology papers. He was a person who had been given 14 soldiers, a collapsing bridge over a chemical river on an Accord-held world called Drevak, and in order to hold that bridge until resupply arrived. Resupply was supposed to take 3 days. It took 11. On the first day, the Accord sent 2 platoons. Barak's unit held the bridge. On the second day, the Accord sent 4 platoons and a light artillery unit. Barak's unit held the bridge. They did it with weapons they had taken off the Accord soldiers from the first day because their own ammunition was running low. On the third day, the Accord sent nothing, which Barak found more worrying than the attacks because it meant they were thinking. On the fourth day, they tried to cut around the river and flank the position. Barak had anticipated this and had placed trip sensors 2 kilometers out on both sides. The flanking units did not succeed. By day 6, Barak had 9 soldiers left. By day 8, he had 6. They ate ration bars and drank recycled water and slept in 2-hour shifts. None of them suggested surrender. None of them suggested pulling back. The bridge led to a fuel distribution hub that served 4 human forward positions. Losing the bridge meant losing the fuel. Losing the fuel meant losing the positions. Losing the positions meant 300 soldiers dying instead of 6. The math was not complicated. An Accord field commander named Wethra was directing the assault on the bridge from a command post 2 kilometers away. On day 7, she sent a message under a white flag protocol offering Barak's unit the chance to surrender with full prisoner rights. The message came back in under 2 minutes. It said, "We are fine here, thank you." Wethra stared at the response for a long time. She sent another message. She asked how many of them were left. There was a pause of about 4 minutes. Then the response came back, "Enough." She later wrote in her field report that she had fought 17 engagements against 8 different species in her career. She wrote that she had a system for predicting when an enemy unit was close to breaking. The system was based on response times, tone of communication, frequency of defensive fire, and movement patterns. She wrote that every metric in her system said Barak's unit should have broken by day 4. She also wrote that she had started to suspect, around day 9, that her system had a flaw. The flaw was that it had been built on data from species that had a survival instinct strong enough to override their sense of duty. She wrote that she was no longer certain humans worked this way. Resupply reached Barak on day 11. The soldiers who arrived found 6 people who had not slept properly in a week, who were out of their own ammunition, who were eating the last of their ration bars, and who were still holding the bridge. The resupply commander asked Barak if he was all right. Barak said yes. The commander asked if he needed medical attention. Barak said later would be fine, and asked if the fuel hub positions were secure. The commander said they were. Barak nodded and sat down on the ground right where he was standing, and did not move for a long time. 3 alien correspondents from neutral species had been following the Drevak campaign with embedded access. They filed their reports separately. All 3 reports said essentially the same thing, in different words. One called it a biological anomaly. One called it the most disturbing thing she had ever witnessed in the field. The third one, an old journalist from the Kalori Confederation who had covered wars for 40 years, wrote a single line that was later reprinted in 9 different galactic languages. These people do not have an off switch. Meanwhile, across 14 separate war fronts, the same pattern was repeating itself. Human units losing ground and then taking it back. Human units cut off and then holding anyway. Human units that should have been destroyed according to every standard military model, still operational, still fighting, still moving forward. And then there was the thing that no military analyst in the Accord had predicted. The thing that made High Jurist S. Sala call an emergency session of the Accord's War Council, and stand at the head of the table with a look on her face that her colleagues had never seen before. The human civilians had started building ships on their own. Not the military yards, not the government programs, ordinary people, shipbuilding companies, engineering firms, university research groups, individual craftspeople with fabrication equipment in their workshops. They had reorganized themselves without any government order, without any central coordination, and had begun producing war materiel because they decided to, because they were angry. Because 4 million people on Vesta Prime were dead, and their ambassador had been executed on a live broadcast, and they were not a species that sat quietly when something like that happened to people they considered their own. Sala looked at the production numbers, she looked at the war maps, she looked at her council. "We made a mistake," she said. Nobody argued with her. The Convergence Assembly had not called an emergency session in 63 years. The last time had been a planet-killing asteroid, and even then, 3 member species had complained about the short notice. This time, every representative arrived early. They came from 31 civilizations. Some of them were old enough to remember the last time a young species had declared a large-scale war, which had been about 400 years ago, and had ended with that species destroying 2 of their own worlds before the others could stop them. Some of them were new enough to the assembly that they had to look up the Total War Declaration on their translation devices during the opening statements to make sure they understood what it actually meant. Elder Vosh of the Tharan people did not need to look anything up. He was, by any measurement, the oldest living individual in the known galaxy. His species lived for approximately 800 years. He was on his 762nd. He had seen civilizations that were now historical footnotes. He had watched species rise into galactic powers and fall into silence. He had, over the course of his long life, developed a very specific feeling in his chest that he had learned to pay attention to. It appeared rarely. It had appeared twice before in his lifetime at moments that had turned out to be pivotal. It was there now. He sat quietly through the first 3 hours of debate and said nothing. The debate was loud. Several accordaline species argued that the assembly should intervene, that humanity had made an illegal and destabilizing declaration, that total war was a concept the galaxy had moved past, that allowing this to continue unchallenged was dangerous. Species that were not accordalined argued that humanity had been provoked, that the glassing of Vesta Prime was itself an act that should have triggered intervention weeks ago, and that the assembly had failed to act when it should have. Several neutral species said nothing useful and asked for more time to consult their governments. Fleet Mistress Rael of the Calori Confederation sat in the middle of the chamber and listened and thought about numbers. The Accord had approached her 3 weeks ago about a joint military action, contributing Calori ships to an Accord counteroffensive aimed at pushing human forces back. It had seemed straightforward at the time. The Accord was a powerful coalition. Humanity was one species. The numbers favored the Accord. The numbers looked different now. Rael had her intelligence officer's reports in her internal reading device. She had read them 4 times. The report said that human ship production had increased by a figure that her intelligence division had initially flagged as a calculation error because it seemed impossible. It was not a calculation error. The reports also said that human ground forces were currently engaged on 14 fronts and were advancing on 12 of them. And the reports said, and this was the part that Rael had read 4 times specifically, that according to every human military analyst her division could find or intercept, the United Earth Command had not yet deployed most of its reserve fleet. They were winning on 14 fronts with, apparently, not everything they had. Rael thought about this for a long time. She thought about what happens to a species that stands beside the losing side of a war involving a people who hold grudges and have very long institutional memories. She had done some research into human history specifically on this point. It was not comforting reading. At the 4-hour mark, Elder Vosh raised one hand. The chamber went quiet. He was not a large person. He was thin and pale and moved slowly. But he was 762 years old, and every species in the room knew it, and when he spoke, people listened. "I have been sitting here," he said in the common tongue, speaking slowly because he always spoke slowly, "trying to decide if this situation is new or if it is something I have seen before in some form." He paused. "I have concluded that it is new. In 700 years I have watched many wars. I have watched strong species fight weak ones. I have watched old powers fall to young ones. But I have never in all that time watched a species declare total war and mean every single word of it." He looked around the room. The Accord destroyed a world and murdered a diplomat. They did this because they believed the response would be manageable. They were wrong. They are still wrong. And I think everyone in this room who is considering getting between humanity and the Accord should think carefully about what it means to step in front of something that does not stop. He lowered his hand and said nothing else. The room was quiet for almost a full minute. 3 days later, the first Accord member species made contact with the United Earth Command. They were a small civilization called the Brev, who had joined the Accord 60 years ago for protection and had never particularly liked Grath's faction. They offered to formally break from the Accord in exchange for guaranteed non-aggression from human forces. Admiral Solis responded within the hour. She agreed to their terms in full. She published the agreement on every open diplomatic channel in the galaxy, with a short note attached that said, "This is what honoring your word looks like." 2 more Accord species contacted Earth Command within the week. Fleet Mistress Rael watched this happen from her office on the Kalori home world. She watched humanity publicly keep 3 promises to 3 former enemies. She thought about the Accord's offer. She thought about the intelligence reports. She thought about Elder Vash's words. Then she called her senior admiral and told him to stand down all Kalori forces from any arrangement with the Accord, effective immediately, citing the need for further review. The admiral asked how long the review would take. "As long as necessary," Rael said, which in diplomatic language meant, "We are not getting involved in this." Meanwhile, in his office on Vora, Grath received news that the Brev had broken from the Accord, then news of the second species, then the third, then Rael's withdrawal. He sat alone in his office for a long time after the last report came in. He had spent 40 years building the Accord into something that nothing could challenge. He had made decisions based on a version of the galaxy that he understood completely. He was beginning to suspect that the galaxy had changed without telling him. Outside his window, the capital's lights were bright against the dark. Vora was beautiful at night. He had always thought so. He thought about it now in a way he had not thought about it before, not as a backdrop to his power, but as a place. A place where people lived. A place that was, for the first time in his long career, starting to feel like it might be something other than permanent. He did not call his council. He did not issue new orders. He sat alone and looked at the lights and did not say anything to anyone for several hours. In the Convergence Assembly, the resolution calling for intervention failed by 11 votes. The galaxy had made its choice, or rather, had chosen not to make one, which, in this case, amounted to the same thing. Humanity continued forward unimpeded. Grath had a plan. He had always had a plan. The Accord's Eastern Fleet, the one that survived because Amara had not yet destroyed it, would punch through the human defensive line near the Keth Passage and drive straight for Earth. Not to win the war. The war was not winnable anymore, and even Grath had accepted this somewhere in the part of his mind where honest thoughts lived. But the attack on Earth would force humanity to pull ships away from the other fronts. It would create breathing room. It would give the Accord time to regroup, restock, rebuild the coalition that was currently falling apart one defecting species at a time. It was a good plan. It was the kind of plan that had worked 14 times in Grath's career. The Eastern Fleet jumped into position on a Tuesday. Grath was watching the operation from the war room on Vora, and for the first 4 minutes it looked exactly as it should. The fleet was in formation. Sensors showed clear space ahead. The jump coordinates for the strike on the human defensive line were loaded and ready. Then the sensors started reporting things that did not make sense. Not enemy ships. The sensors were not picking up enemy ships. What they were picking up was a field of objects, small objects, spread across a volume of space approximately 40,000 kilometers wide and 30,000 deep, positioned directly along the fleet's approach vector. The objects were not weapons platforms. They were not mines. They did not match any known classification in the Accord's database. The fleet commander spent 6 minutes trying to determine what they were. He sent a probe forward. The probe reached the field and transmitted 1 second of data before it stopped transmitting. The data showed that the objects were passive relay devices, very small, very cheap, seeded through the area in an overlapping grid pattern. The commander started to understand what this meant, and he did not like what he understood, and he opened a channel to Vora to recommend pulling back. The field activated before he finished the sentence. The relay devices were not weapons. They were the trigger network for a minefield that had been placed in the space around them over the preceding 3 weeks by 12 different small human vessels operating under complete signal silence. The mines themselves were buried inside hollow asteroid fragments, indistinguishable from natural debris. The field had been placed there before the Eastern Fleet had even been given its orders, because Admiral Solis had read Grath's operational patterns for 11 years and had written, in a private planning document 6 weeks before the war started, if this goes wrong, he will try to hit Earth directly through the Keth approach. Do not let him. In the war room on Vora, Grath watched the Eastern Fleet's signal go silent. Not damaged, not retreating, silent, all of it, in under 4 minutes. The aide standing next to him said nothing. Nobody in the room said anything. They all looked at the screen where the fleet had been and was not anymore, and the silence in that room was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. 3 hours later, the UEC fleet arrived at Vora. It did not arrive like a raiding party. It arrived like a fact. Ships filled every approach vector, every viable exit route, every gap in the system's orbital geometry. They had not come to fight their way in. They had come because they were already in, positioned over the preceding 2 weeks while the Eastern Fleet had been preparing its strike. While Grath had been watching one hand, Solis had been operating with the other. Grath made a broadcast. He made it to every Accord-affiliated world still standing, which was fewer than he would have liked. He told them to fight, to resist, to remember what the Accord stood for and hold firm against the human offensive. Most of them did not respond. Of the ones that did, more than half asked for the frequency to reach Earth Command. High Jurist S. Sala had been preparing for this moment for 2 weeks. She had not told Grath. She had spent 2 weeks quietly reviewing every piece of law in the Accord's foundational charter, looking for the mechanism by which a senior council member could override military command authority in the event of catastrophic strategic failure. The mechanism existed. It was obscure. It had never been used. She used it now. She opened a channel to the UES Unbroken, Admiral Solis' flagship. She stated her name, her title, and her authority, and she said, "I am requesting surrender terms for the civilian population of Vora. The Accord's military forces on this world are under my authority effective immediately. I am standing them down. Please respond." There was a pause of about 40 seconds. Then Solis responded. Her voice was even and clear. She offered complete protection for Vora's civilian population. She offered medical assistance for wounded combatants on both sides. She offered S. Sala personal guarantee that civilian infrastructure would not be targeted. In return, she required the full deactivation of all military systems on Vora and the immediate surrender of all Accord command personnel. S. Sala accepted every condition without modification. Human forces landed on Vora 4 hours later. The landings were orderly. Every soldier had received the same briefing before they set foot on the ground. This is not revenge. Civilians are protected. Infrastructure is protected. You are here to end the war, not to burn the city. Grath did not surrender. He retreated to a hardened bunker beneath the capital and activated the one weapon he had left, a biosphere device, old technology, capable of rendering Vora's surface uninhabitable for decades. He sent a broadcast directly to Solis. He told her that if she did not pull her forces back, he would use it. She did not pull back. What happened instead was that Captain Amara, who had been tracking Grath's movements since the moment the surrender was announced, had already placed 2 destroyers in direct orbit above the bunker's location. When the biosphere device activated its launch sequence, it was destroyed inside its own silo by a precision strike that the UEC had been ready to execute for 11 hours. Grath was found in the bunker 12 hours after that. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He sat in a chair surrounded by screens that showed him a city that was still standing, a population that was still alive, and human soldiers in the streets below who were handing out medical supplies. He looked like a person trying to understand something that his mind could not accommodate. He was placed under formal arrest by 2 UEC soldiers who were extremely professional about it. He was read his rights under the United Earth War Crimes Statute. He was told that his trial would be public, conducted under law, and broadcast to every species in the galaxy. He was told that he would have access to legal counsel. He said nothing the entire time. The broadcast of his arrest went out across every channel within the hour. In the Convergence Assembly, the reception was somewhere between stunned and reverent. This was not how wars ended, as a rule. Wars ended in the destruction of the loser, or in terms that humiliated them, or in occupations that lasted generations. They did not end with the victor arresting the enemy leader and preparing a trial. Liaison Neva Oren watched the broadcast from her office and felt something she had not felt in many weeks. She was not sure what to call it. She thought about it for a while. She decided the closest word for it was relief, not because the war was over, because of the specific way it was ending, because she had been afraid in her darkest moments that humanity was going to win this war in a way that made the galaxy more frightening than it had been before. They had not. They had won it and then done something even harder. They had been decent about it. She poured herself a drink. She thought it was probably warranted. 1 year is not a long time in galactic history. Most civilizations measure their important changes in centuries. The Tharan, whose records go back 6,000 years, consider anything less than a generation to be a moment, not a period. Elder Vash, who had 762 years of perspective to draw on, would have agreed with this under ordinary circumstances. He did not consider these circumstances ordinary. 12 months after the fall of Vora, he stood in the rebuilt hall of the Convergence Assembly and looked at a room that had physically changed shape. New seats had been added. The circular layout had been expanded. At the far end of the room, in a position that had been empty for the entire history of the Assembly, there was now a seat occupied by a human representative. Not a conqueror's throne. A chair. Same material as the others. Same dimensions. Just in a place where no chair had been before. This, Vash thought, was the detail that would make historians argue for the next 500 years. The galaxy after humanity's war was quieter in some ways and louder in others. The Dominion Accord no longer existed. Its member species were free, which most of them were relieved about, and demilitarized, which some of them were less certain about. Human reconstruction teams were active on 14 of the former Accord worlds, rebuilding water systems, power grids, and communications infrastructure. Nobody had asked them to. The United Earth Command had simply decided that a broken galaxy was not a safe one, and had deployed engineers and doctors and logistics specialists the same way it had previously deployed warships, thoroughly and without waiting for permission. High Jurist S. Sala was working alongside the UEC's Reconstruction Office. This had not been in any peace agreement. She had volunteered. She had spent 6 months trying to understand why humans had chosen to rebuild the places they had just finished fighting to take, and she had eventually concluded that the answer was simply that this was what they were like. They were a species that could hold two completely opposite drives: the drive to fight something until it stopped existing, and the drive to fix something once it was broken, and switch between them without apparent contradiction. She found this baffling. She also found it, against her better judgment, something close to admirable. Grath's trial had concluded 3 months earlier. It had been exactly what Solis promised: public, conducted under law, broadcast across the galaxy. He had been found guilty on 7 counts relating to the destruction of Vesta Prime and the murder of Ambassador Hess and several other charges. He had not been executed. He was serving a term in a human detention facility where he had access to reading materials, regular meals, and a legal appeals process. Several Accord species had watched the verdict broadcast and had asked, through their representatives, whether this was normal human legal procedure. They had been told that it was. The conversation that followed in various diplomatic and cultural circles, about what justice meant, about whether it required death to be serious, about why a species capable of the military campaign humanity had just conducted would then turn around and give its greatest enemy a library card, would continue for decades. It was, Elder Vosh thought, probably the most interesting conversation the galaxy had had in several centuries. In Geneva, Councillor Petra Vance stood before the rebuilt assembly and gave the only formal speech she had made since the day she signed the Total War Declaration. She was not a natural orator. She spoke plainly, without flourish, and anyone hopping for triumphant language about humanity's greatness went away disappointed. She spoke about Vesta Prime for a long time. She named the number, 4,312,000 dead. She said it slowly enough that it could be translated and processed by every species in the room. She talked about what those people had been: farmers, teachers, engineers, children. She talked about Doran Hess and what 19 years of diplomatic patience looked like in a person, and what it meant that such a person had been killed for it. She said the war had been necessary. She did not say it had been good. She did not say humanity had been heroic. She said humanity had done what it had to do, and that the cost of it would not be forgotten, and that the purpose of the chair now sitting at the far end of the assembly was not to represent power, but to represent the obligation that came with it. "We are not here," she said, "because we won. We are here because this is what winning is supposed to lead to. And if it does not lead to this, to a room where everyone has a seat, where the rules apply to everyone, where what happened to Vesta Prime cannot be done to anyone again, then we won nothing." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet for quite a long time. Admiral Renata Solis was not in the assembly when Vance spoke. She had been offered a position as humanity's military governor over the former Accord territories. She had declined it in a message so short that the aide who received it first assumed it was a transmission error. It said simply, "Find someone else. I am going home." She was in a city in what used to be called the state of California when Vance's speech was broadcast. She had found a place to rent near the coast. She had been sleeping for approximately 10 hours a night for 6 weeks, which was more than she had slept in the preceding 2 years combined. She had not worn a uniform since the day she submitted her resignation from active command. She had, very slowly, been learning that the part of her that had been in a state of preparation for most of her adult life did not know how to stop, and that this was going to take time, and that this was acceptable. She was sitting outside when she heard a small child on the street nearby ask an older person what was happening on the broadcast playing from a screen in the window across the road. The older person explained, briefly, that humanity had made peace. The child asked who humanity had been fighting. The older person said a lot of people who had done something very bad and then lost the argument. The child thought about this. Then the child asked if it was over now. The older person said yes, it was over. The child appeared satisfied with this and went back to whatever they had been doing. Soli sat with that for a while. Over. A strange word for something that had rearranged the galaxy, but the child had found it sufficient, and maybe that was the point. The things that changed everything were supposed to eventually become normal, were supposed to become background, were supposed to become the world that children grew up in without knowing it had ever been different. On Vora, in a neighborhood that had spent 3 months without running water and now had it back, a small alien child stood in the street watching a human engineer replace a section of water pipe. The engineer was big and loud and spoke to his crew in a language the child did not understand. He looked strange. His face was almost flat and his eyes were the wrong color, and he moved quickly in the way that adult humans always seemed to, like they were slightly in a hurry even when they had nowhere to be. The engineer noticed the child watching him. He stopped what he was doing. He reached into the chest pocket of his work jacket and pulled out a small wrapped rectangle. He looked at it for a moment, then tossed it gently across the space between them. The child caught it without thinking. It was flat and dark brown and smelled unlike anything on Vora. The child had no idea what it was. She looked at the engineer. He made a gesture with his hand. Go on. She opened the wrapper. She broke off a small piece and put it in her mouth. She had no word in her language for the experience that followed, because nothing on her world tasted like this. She stared at the engineer. He grinned at her, the wide, flat-faced human grin that her parents had warned her could be alarming, but which, in this particular moment, was the least alarming thing she had ever seen. She ate the rest of it. The engineer laughed and went back to work. The child stood there for a long moment with an empty wrapper in her hands. Then she looked at the pipe coming out of the ground, clean and new, and at the humans working around it, and at the water that had started running from the fountain at the end of the street this morning for the first time in months. She did not have words yet for what she was thinking. She was 6 years old, and the galaxy had just changed, and she was standing in the middle of it with chocolate on her fingers. Somewhere across the galaxy, a species was beginning to learn that the thing that scared them most about humanity had never been the weapons. It had always been everything else.